Yeah.
There you go.
I guess you're, I do. Quite a bit actually. Whitetail and ducks as well. Big duck hunter. Love to be in the cold water and early mornings for sure. What about you?
Arkansas is the duck hunting capital of the world, or the U.S., right? Like it's one of the best states, isn't it?
Yeah, duck hunting capital of the world.
That's
It
awesome.
is. It's the flyways have kind of changed a little bit within the last decade or so. But as far as population goes, yeah, we still have just an abundance of waterfowl population.
Because it's there's two flyways that kind of converge
Mm-hmm.
over Arkansas, right? Or is it just one?
Yeah, they kind of do converge there. The Mississippi flyways, the major one that we get an influx of the waterfowl from, and it seems to be the one that has the most variability, like within the last decade or so. But I feel like we're on the upward trend, and I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the monocrop agriculture and just how much farmland is here, because we're also the rice capital of the world, and we have a ton of rice, ton of corn, beans, soybeans, everything. So that's kind of influenced it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I believe that. There's do you know who Clay Newcomb is?
I do. Yeah. I've never met him, but yeah, man, that dude is awesome.
He the hillbilly, what's his word? Where he like he thinks hillbilly is a compliment, which I love. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, he's an Ozark man, and the Ozarks are just a really big travel point for people to come to Arkansas, and for people that live in Arkansas, it's a huge destination as well. But yeah, he's a hillbilly for sure. He kind of lives out that true in the sticks, living off most of the land that's around him, and yeah, it's just a life here, man. It really is for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. Honestly, we can just go ahead and start there. I'll say, Austin, thank you for coming on, man. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I'm super excited to talk to you, get to know you more, and run this up.
Likewise, man. So yeah, we were just talking about Arkansas, where you're from, and the lifestyle that is almost like intertwined with at least a lot of the places that you can live in Arkansas. I don't know if there's like any big cities or anything. Honestly, I'm not super familiar, but the overall, just with the land lifestyle, is that something that you grew up like knowing was a part of the Arkansas nature?
Yeah, it's something that I grew up not knowing any different, really. Growing up, I was always going to deer camp every weekend, or around Thanksgiving, and deer season is going to start. This is the 31st of October, so everybody knows the deer season starts in 2 weeks from now. So it was just a part of life, man. And I grew up in very southern Arkansas, almost on the Louisiana line, and we were really close to a wildlife management area called Felsenthal, and it's just a huge region for duck hunting, for fishing. It's right on the Saline and Ouachita River area. So I grew up around it, and most people that live in Arkansas, that is what they do. They hunt and they fish, unless you're in a little bit larger city, but there's really not huge cities in Arkansas. The couple biggest ones would be like Fayetteville or the Little Rock area.
Man, that's awesome. And I can relate to that to a much smaller degree. And I think, so I've been hunting my whole life. I think my first deer I killed when I was like 9 or 10. My dad always made that a point for us. And we lived actually in the city of Atlanta, which is a massive city.
Yeah.
But he always made it a point when we weren't playing baseball or football. We had a little lease out about an hour and a half outside of Atlanta. So we'd always rip it. And I think it exposed just enough of like my true nature to know that I love that. And so I've always had this admiration for folks like yourself and what sounds like to be most what would you say somebody from our Arkansas is, an Arkansan?
Yeah, Arkansans.
Yeah, I've always had this admiration for folks like Arkansans and obviously all across the U.S., but just people like yourself that grew up not knowing any different than going to deer camp and being out in nature. And it's cool to see at least on your Twitter content now and stuff. I know that you're big into that still, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's just something that's very instilled in me, and I see a ton of value in it. And this is probably something that you see as well. You grew up, like you said, took your first deer at 8 or 9 years old. There really is a ton of value in not only wildlife management or harvesting wild game, but just being in the woods, just immersing yourself in nature, kind of going into the environment to where it's a little bit more of a primal setting. You just kind of get to watch the sun climb the trees in the morning, the fog's coming off the creek, and then you just see life kind of go on, even though that it doesn't know you exist in the woods. And it provides a ton of value, in my opinion. And unless you grow up doing it, I think the only exposure you probably get to something like that is going hiking or maybe camping or backpacking. But then when you add the element of, hunting, harvesting wild game in order to put fresh meat on the table for your family, that to me provides an even more in-depth spiritual experience.
100% agree. And I firmly believe that it's actually hardwired specifically in men. Like even I think it's in every man, like somewhere down there, but like to protect and provide. So that hunting itch is a real thing. And I think that's why when people do get exposed to it, if they haven't throughout their life, like when even in later in life, they're like, what's going on? Like they don't even know what's happening, but it's actually just scratching some like hardwired itch in our physiology and our neurology. You're exactly right. I love what you just said. The sun's climbing the trees, man. That's a good way to put it. Because in Georgia, at least, there's tall pine trees. So I have clear vision right now of a specific spot on our hunting lease. I know, like, it's literally just I would hunt in the tree stand, and the sun would just climb up the trees behind me, man. That's beautiful stuff.
Thank you, man.
Do you have any like favorite thing to hunt?
Oh man, that's a great question. As of right now, it's probably waterfowl. So duck hunting for sure. Something about it really is more of kind of an action-packed type of hunt. So everything can kind of happen all at once if you have a group of ducks that's circling overhead. Whereas whitetail hunting would be a little bit slower. You're just kind of either sitting in a tree or in a box stand or in a blind somewhere, just kind of waiting on things to happen. Ducks, they tend to just cause a little bit more action. You can talk a little bit while you're in the blind, and it doesn't disturb anything unless you've got your eyes shining to the sky when the group's flying over. So you get to hang out with your buddies and have a good time. But yeah, it's just, and waterfowl, it just gives you a huge sense of like immersion. It really does, because most of the time in the way that I hunt, we hunt in the timber a lot. So the flooded timber, so you're actually having to wade through, knee to waist deep water to get to the hole, and you're freezing most of the time, and you're literally part of where you're hunting. You really have to get deep into there, and I kind of like the challenge that it provides versus like sitting in a box stand just waiting on a deer across a lane.
Absolutely. And I got to make this comment that it says a lot about you and any man who prefers waterfowl hunting, because like you said, you're 99% chance you're going to be freezing your ass off. It's going to be early in the morning. And especially when you're hunting flooded timbers, that's definitely like, it's not the easiest hunt. And I'm totally in agreement with the whitetail thing as well. Have you ever hunted out west? Because I'm certainly more drawn towards that type of big game hunting, as opposed to, like you mentioned, just sitting in a stand. I like the idea of a spot and stalk situation where you're kind of like interacting a little bit more with the landscape and the animals.
I actually haven't been out west. It is a big goal of mine within the next year or two to draw a tag for an elk, either in Colorado or maybe Montana or something like that. Big goal of mine is to go out there, and it's not even that I want to harvest an animal. That would be great because it would fill my freezer with a ton of meat. But the experience of getting to hunt in that type of environment is something that has really been itching at me. And up until this point, I don't know, wasn't financially available to like just pick up and leave and go out there and, set up camp. And I didn't really have anybody that I knew that did that to like go and show me the ropes out there either. So, now that I'm on Twitter and have a few more connections, should be setting some stuff up within the next couple of years.
I mean, that's also another an unintended benefit of Twitter is like who would have thought you would have used Twitter? Because I'm the same way now. There's a guy named Tristan Scott who you may know from Decentralized Radio, Bitcoin and Beef guy.
Oh yeah.
He's out in Wyoming, and
Really?
his first hunt ever. Get this, his first hunt ever in his life was like 2 years ago, and he killed an elk.
Wow. Of course, beginner's luck there,
Yeah.
That's cool.
But, I mean, we've kind of got into it. There's definitely different types of podcasts out there. There's like a spectrum, in my opinion, where like some are more idea, expertise, sort of like specific points. I focus more on stories, and then like we go from there, just because like that's what interests me. Like I want to learn about your story, learn about how you got from a young man in Arkansas to a guy who's like an expert in feet and stuff. So if you could run me through your story, man. Like how did you get to where you are now from where you were?
Yeah, man, I love that too. Just that's one of my favorite hobbies is just listening to someone's story. So I think the route that you're taking with the podcast is amazing. I love that. But to get into mine specifically, so yeah, like I mentioned earlier, grew up very South Arkansas, very small town. Population was like 5,000 or so, and grew up going to high school. Played all types of athletics: football, baseball, tennis, golf. Anything that was offered really is what I was into. So super athletic during high school, and I wanted to kind of keep that trend going. I knew I wanted to be outside, involved in some type of sport as best as possible, even if I wasn't like it wasn't a goal of mine to necessarily play college baseball, although I probably could have if I wanted to, maybe a JUCO or something like that, which I know you have a baseball background from what I've learned, but it just didn't. I knew that I wasn't going to go any further than that. So my route changed to, okay, what can I do in order to stay around athletics more? So when I was like a junior and senior in high school, I was actually dating a girl that was in college, and she was an athletic training student. So she was in about her second year or so. So when I would go stay with her on the weekends and stuff, I kind of got an inside look of what athletic training looked like from a practitioner or a student perspective, at least. And it looked cool, but man, it was so involved, like in times that you wanted to have your free time. So practices were at 5 a.m. Then you had to do treatments after practice, and then they have afternoon weightlifting sessions, and you got to be there for that, and treatments after that. Games are always on Friday nights, Saturdays. So there was like no free time. And I was like, I just don't really want to give away all my free time for athletic training. So the next thing was going to be physical therapy. And for now, physical therapy, to be a actual physical therapist, is a doctorate of physical therapy, which means that you have to go for a 4-year undergrad and either 3 to 4 years after your undergrad in order to obtain that. And I was not a fan of school, did not like sitting in a classroom either. So I was like, man, I just don't want to waste 8 years of my life. In my opinion, it would be wasted, because I wasted a whole lot of time in high school, in my opinion, just sitting there not learning. So my mom actually found out about PTA, which means physical therapist assistant. And if you're unfamiliar with the PT scope, then it's kind of like a physician and a physician's assistant. That's kind of the same kind of levels, I guess, in the physical therapy realm. So that school was only 2.5 years, and you could obtain an associate's degree and go straight to work. So that's exactly what I did. Like 6 weeks after I graduated high school, I started college classes. I got all my prereqs. Luckily, got into a very competitive program my first try, and then went through that, got out, and then my my barefoot wheel journey kind of started once I got out of college there. So when I was in PTA school, we had to do clinicals. So first clinical I went to was in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, and that's a place where there's two Division II colleges and about 3 or 4 surrounding high schools. And the boss there, he's like, "Man, I just want you to come work for me after you graduate." So I took the job, started to work there. We were connected to a huge gym. And like I said, there's a ton of athletic population that came through the clinic as well. So what got me into the foot expertise realm was I just noticed that a lot of these super high level athletes were super strong, but their baseline mechanics of like how they were moving were just piss poor. And they just had a tendency to be super injury prone. And I couldn't figure out why. Like, what's this disconnect here? Like, they obviously have a good coaching staff, strengthening staff. What's the disconnect? And it wasn't until I scrolled Instagram one day, came across a video about Vivo barefoot shoes. And I was like, that's an oxymoron. This is kind of catching my attention. What's this mean? So dove down the rabbit hole, ordered a pair of Vivo barefoot shoes, got them in, wore them cold turkey, didn't transition like I was supposed to. And dude, it quite frankly changed my life. It really opened my eyes to how your foundation affects your body. So like immediately within the first week, I noticed that my back was super sore, but it did seem a little bit easier to engage my abdominals. My hamstrings seemed to be a little bit more easy to engage. And then from that point on, I was like, man, like if I'm noticing these differences, then what can I learn in addition to what I already know to provide more value to my clients and patients? And so I just learned as much as possible within the first 2.5 years I was in that clinic, and started applying my knowledge and started seeing pretty noticeable differences in outcomes for patients. So from that point on, that changed the way that I treat patients, and it's changing the way that I work with clients now as a coach.
That's a fascinating journey. And I think, so as you mentioned earlier, I have a baseball background. So and I played in college. So I was always the type of guy who was looking for that next, like I was just trying to optimize to the point where I became neurotic. But it was always like something I was looking for. I was looking for like, what does this professional guy do? What does this guy do? And I remember hearing early on in my career that Ichiro Suzuki spent like 45 minutes a day on his feet. And I'm like, the hell? Like, that was something I had never heard before. I'm like, what do you mean he spends 45 minutes a day on his foot health? Like, that sounds asinine. And then you kind of take a step back. That guy had an extremely long career that was extremely high performing. But that kind of got me on the rabbit hole. And I'm curious because I actually also started my my barefoot shoe journey. I had always, like, whenever I could, I would walk barefoot. Like when I'm going on walks around the neighborhood, walks around the yard, all these types of things, I would go barefoot. But that was while I had like regular shoes. And then when I switched to barefoot, like Vivo specifically, I didn't notice any of those mechanistic sort of like withdrawals, I guess. So why do you think that is?
So it could be a lot to do with the amount of time that you were spending, completely barefoot prior to. A lot of people, their body just adapts differently. So, you could have had a pretty good baseline of foot strength going into your barefoot shoe journey. Whereas me, and even now I still have a little bit of residual, like noticeable curvature of my middle two toes, even though the functionality of my toes has improved significantly. The amount of time when I was young that I spent in super restrictive baseball cleats really changed the shape of my toes. And what I didn't know way back then, it was like the pain that I was getting in my heels. It was all due to those cleats. So up until I was at that point of, in the PT clinic, I had been in pretty restrictive athletic shoes up until that point, athletic shoes and cleats. And you had as well, but your body just reacted differently. And that's just a testament to, in quotes here, every body is different. So, you will just see different outcomes for different people.
And did you have any injuries that kind of opened your eyes to foot health specifically, or was it just looking at other uh, athletes that were, like you mentioned, strong and high performing athletes, but kind of noticing their tendencies, or was there something like within your own body that you noticed one time and was like, okay, I need to look into this?
The only thing that I noticed as far as like there was a trend with I would have really bad low back spasms, um, and I couldn't really figure out why. And it wasn't until probably a year or two after that I noticed that I wouldn't throw my back out as easy, and put together that just the elevation of the heel of any type of shoe, it can be a tennis shoe or a dress shoe, actually changes the positioning of your pelvis. So it shifts it to be more of an anterior pelvic tilt, which means that there's an increase in the lordotic curve in your low back. Uh, and I didn't really put that together until, like I said, maybe a year or so after I made the transition. So I was unaware of the injury, or the tendency for injury up until I just kind of made this connection. And the only other previous injury I'd had before was, like I said, the heel pain, and then the curvature of my toes structurally was altered from being in those restrictive toe box shoes and cleats for so long.
What do you so, because I think a lot of people are honestly just write it off. At least that's been my
Hmm.
experience. They're like, oh, whatever. Like, you don't need, like, is it really that big of a deal? What would you say to somebody who is like my age, like 24 years old, who's only worn regular shoes and has never really explored barefoot and hasn't really noticed any, maybe per se, uh, like overt negatives? What would you
Yeah.
say to them to like ease their skepticism?
I was thinking about this in the shower this morning, actually, this very question. So I would tell these people to go look at their grandmother's feet, go look at their grandfather's feet, their great aunt, their great uncle. This is something that is visually a negative consequence of wearing overly restrictive, non anatomically correct type of shoes. And you see those results visually by assessing the older generation's feet, because our bodies are extremely adaptable, but a lot of times things take a little bit longer to see visually the effects of a negative adaptation. So it is a lot easier to see it in the generations that are older than us. Um, and if it's not addressed at its root, or if it's not addressed at a prior time in your life, then you may not feel or notice the effects at that point in your life. But as time goes on, if you leave these negative, variables into your life, then eventually it's going to catch up to you. Just like anything else, like if you keep eating junk food and super processed foods, more than likely when you're young, your body just does a little bit better job of accepting it and kind of riding through it. But then when you get into your 30s and 40s, you start to really notice these negative effects catch up with you. And it's the same type of principle with footwear. And I think when you put it in a logical perspective as well, it's your foundation. I mean, you really have no other form of more common transportation than walking on your feet during your life. It's literally your contact with the ground. So, in my opinion, that's pretty important for the rest of your body to make sure that the foundation is set. And an analogy, super simple analogy. If you have a crack in the foundation of the slab of your home, then eventually that's going to lead to a crack in the wall. And eventually that crack in the wall is going to lead to a crack in the ceiling. And that crack in the ceiling is eventually going to allow water to leak in. And then before you know it, a couple of years goes by and your entire wall of your house is ruined. You got to get a foundation redone. So kind of the same thing goes on with the human body.
It's funny that you said first foundation and then use that exact analogy. That was going to be like my next follow up question or point, because what I've told people, or not told people, what I've expressed, um, when people have asked, or maybe sometimes when people don't ask. But the the feet, like, so I always say it starts with your feet, your physical health. Like, it starts with your feet. What happens with your feet affects your ankles. Your ankle health affects your knee health. Your knee health affects your hip health. Your hip affects your spine. And if you have a bad spine, good luck. That's kind of been like my spiel.
Mm.
Is there merit to that? Is that correct? Or have I been spewing lies?
No, man, the kinetic chain approach that you're talking about is 100%, it's a fact. The foundation will affect everything above. There's a really strong correlation between the physical, like, ability to spread your big toe and to grip the ground with the floor with your feet to facilitate your arch, and your ability to contract the glutes properly, to facilitate at your hips, to be able to torque your knees out to the side using the hips in order to kind of put you in a proper squat position. So 100%. And then, like you alluded to, the low back as well, or the spine. So I kind of talked about this earlier, how an elevation at the heel of your foot places you in basically a forward position. So if you just think about standing on an inch thick book under your heels, then automatically that's going to push your body's center of mass forward. So the body has to compensate for that because it doesn't like being off balance. So most people will compensate by tilting the pelvis forward. And when you tilt the pelvis forward, anterior pelvic tilt, it creates a big curve in the low back, which is lordosis, which also creates more kyphosis at the thoracic spine. So there's a whole lot of like rounded shoulders, exaggerated curvature in the low back. And then you have a lot of people that deal with hip impingement in the front of their hips, which leads to, alludes to that anterior pelvic tilt has changed the way that your femur, the ball of your femur bone, sits in the acetabulum, which is the socket of your hip. And so it really does cause a whole lot of altered natural posture and mechanics based off of where your foundation is set.
And there's two things there. I want to go back to that foundation analogy first, because I think that's such a good analogy as it relates to this, because like you said, you might not notice the foundation in your home is cracked for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see a crack in the wall and you might be like, oh, it's just a crack in the wall. And then years later, before you know it, you got a crack in your ceiling. And like you said, that's when real problems start to happen. But all of that could have been mitigated by just by steps at the beginning. And the other thing I wanted to point out or ask about, really, just because like most shoes, the vast majority of modern shoes, I don't know what, I guess the drop is what you'd call it. They're elevated in the back and they're like slightly thinner in the front. So like it's like almost like a little wedge. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's referred to as drop. Yeah, you're exactly right.
And are you like, do you only wear no drop or zero drop shoes now? Is that like exclusive to you?
Yeah, personally, I don't ever wear anything with an elevated heel unless I'm in my waders or my muck boots, and they just don't make those type of footwear, I guess, in any type of zero drop. So yeah, I'm always in zero drop.
Back to the guy who's my age, and maybe works out and is in good physical shape for the most part, and is skeptical of this whole barefoot thing. I'm fine up till now. Mm-hmm. They start to ease their skepticism, start to see a little bit of merit into what you're saying. What's like the first step for them? What would you recommend they do, like actionably? Like what's the first practical step that you would recommend they take?
Yeah, so I would recommend taking the transition kind of slow and steady, and being sure that you listen to your body. So making some notes, some mental notes, maybe even jotting a few things down, either in your phone or on paper, about, what you felt during the first week or two when you're in your barefoot shoes. And typically, like when I take on a client that's never worn any type of zero drop or wide toe box shoe or minimalist shoe, we take the process relatively slow because they've been in these conventional footwear shoes for multiple decades, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So it will be a pretty significant change to get them in a true minimalist shoe. And you can buy shoes like Ultras, for instance, that are a transition shoe to kind of help ease the process. But taking it slow and steady, and then being aware of the changes that your body is telling you it's making, is a key point to this. And then having the discernment to say, look, my calves are like super strained, they're super sore, my feet are really sore to the point where I don't want to walk as many steps during the day, then you may be wearing the minimalist shoes too much at that point. So maybe just, if you're walking 10K steps a day, then maybe just knock that down to about 5K steps for your first couple of weeks. And then progressively, it's just like progressive overload in any type of other workout routine. So you can just gradually progress and let your body acclimate accordingly.
I appreciate your pragmatic approach to that, because I think, just like with anything, or most things rather, people have a tendency to make it dogmatic and approach it in a dogmatic way, meaning like barefoot's the only way, like you need to be barefoot. And I actually spoke with Melker from Wide, who I know you're acquainted with.
Yeah.
That's like kind of his whole mission with Wide, is it's got a little bit thicker of a sole. And he mentioned that the thought process behind that is, if there's some person that's been wearing traditional shoes for 50 years, going from a regular shoe with a significant drop and a significant cushion, going straight to like a 4 millimeter sole, is probably going to do more harm than good. And so I appreciate the nuanced approach, and not just saying like dying on the hill of like you need to be barefoot all the time from day one. Because like you said, we've kind of built up this tolerance, or at least most people have. There's also another thing that I used to do when it's funny, because I'm imagining myself, like my older self, like arguing with people about this. I don't know if I was arguing or just like bringing up a point, but I would show people pictures of like African tribesmen feet, or like just like people's feet who actually have never worn shoes. And you see for people that are listening, I'm like, you see their feet are like wide. They're not just like these crumpled up little curved hammer-toed feet, right? It's like these wide hands almost. And that to me was like the visual cue. I would look down at my own feet and be like, okay, something's wrong. And I kind of want to touch on the hammer toe. What exactly is that's a term I've heard, and I guess I kind of understand that it's like the pinky toe or something like that. What is hammer toe?
Yeah, so hammer toes can affect all 5 toes, mainly the 4 smaller toes. And this is a result of a few things that are included within conventional footwear or modern footwear. So we talked about the drop already, and how this places your foot in a downward slope position. Well, if you take a look at the other end of the shoe, most modern shoes have a toe spring, which means that you can kind of see a slight curvature up. It lifts the toes up a little bit. So when we combine this downward slope into an upward curvature, in addition to a tapered, narrow toe box, so most toe box in conventional shoes are super narrow, they're kind of in a triangular type of shape, then you have a combination of all 3 of these elements, in addition to a final 4th element, which would be the physical 2-dimensional restriction that most conventional shoes place your foot in mechanics-wise. So this would mean that your forefoot is only allowed to bend into flexion and extension, so up and down, instead of it contouring to the surface that's below your foot in multiple different planes. So there's 4 main elements: the drop, the toe spring, the narrow toe box, and the rigidity of the sole of the shoe. And when you combine all these effects, then if you were to watch somebody's foot, let's just say you could see the internal side of the shoe when they walk, then the actual ball of the foot is going to make contact with the bottom of the sole of the shoe, but then you have this extended from just down from the metatarsals. So basically at the edge of your toes where they connect to the main part of the foot, they will extend. But then at that point, they don't really have anywhere to go because of the tapered, narrow toe box. So they squish together, and then you have this toe spring, which is lifting the toes when they need to fully extend. So you get this weird mechanic repetitive, with every step that you take, altered mechanics or biomechanics with each and every step. So it really puts your toes in a cramped up, non-natural formation or kind of coordination mechanics during these steps.
Is it possible to reverse that? Like if it's uh like if you've been wearing those shoes for a certain period of time, is it possible to like reverse that sort of adaptation?
Yeah, so it very much is possible, and I've helped quite a few people reverse it. It does take time, um, because you've been in conventional footwear and you've had hammer toes for, like I said, multiple decades. Then you can't expect a significant amount of change within, just a few months. You might feel a pretty good amount of change, but visually it would be a little bit harder to get that amount of change in such a short time. But everybody is different. So you may see some people that have a higher success sooner. Some people just may take a little bit more time. But yeah, you can definitely see some change, especially, when you get into the 2-3 year mark. If you took a picture of your feet in the beginning and took a picture, 2 or 3 years from now, more than likely you would be blown away about the amount of change.
The thing that's interesting to me, so you think about women specifically, especially in like the corporate world, maybe not as much in Arkansas, but in like big cities, these women are going to work in high heels and stuff like that, which I can't imagine. I just can't imagine a worse position for your feet to be in. What's your take on that? Like the high heels for women?
Just throw them away, man. Just put them in the garbage. Like, I know it's aesthetically, it really is like, even when I take my wife out, let's just say it's our anniversary date. She wants to wear some heels, just because, she looks gorgeous. Then go ahead, wear the heels on occasion. But like you said, a lot of women are even forced to wear a heel in the work environment, especially in like offices. That's just when your feet are in an environment, primarily in a situation like that, then man, there really needs to be a lot of change that happens around that expectation.
What would you? So say there's a woman who's been wearing high heels, or I mean, even you could say like cowboy boots for guys. Like a lot of cowboy boots have pretty serious amount of drop, and then also like that toe spring.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody that's been wearing like a guy that's been wearing cowboy boots, or a woman that's been wearing heels for years and years and years. What's the first step? And I know you kind of already touched on like taking it slowly, but I mean that's a pretty going from like a 2 or 3 inch heel to even to like a regular shoe. That's probably a pretty significant change for your body. What would you recommend they do?
Yeah, that there would be a lot more situational dependent. So this is why I work with coaching clients so closely one on one, is because there are situations like this. Um, it's going to be a harder process. So taking it ultra slow. A lot of times we can use the tools of modernity and the tools that are prescribed, let's just say in the podiatry world, such as a heel lift in a conventional Nike, or a heel lift in an Adidas or something like that. Something that is going to allow us to, raise their heel closely to what they're typically in. And then eventually we can kind of lower the amount of elevation that their heel is over time. So these heel lifts, let's just say we had, a half-inch heel lift in underneath their foot. And then eventually we want to go down to a quarter, an eighth, and then eventually we can plane out. But that would be a process. Like if they're wearing heels every day, and they can't really walk, and I've seen this before, can't walk in anything but a heel, then more than likely we'd start a process of, and this is what I'm doing with most of my one-on-one clients as well, is taking them through a process of mobility and strengthening, either before or simultaneously with the shoe transition. So we just provide a whole lot more of a stimulus to the body that the central nervous system can recognize, hey, our mechanics are continuously changing and our body needs to adapt around these continuous stimuli.
And so to a guy, like for myself or like one of my buddies, the appeal of better performance over the long term is appealing, right? Like that's enticing
Yeah.
to us. So that could potentially draw somebody away from traditional shoes into a more natural barefoot existence. For a woman, I feel like it might be a little bit more. That's not enticing, right? Like to say, hey, like you'll have better athletic performance if you stop wearing heels. That's probably
Yeah.
not going to be like super enticing to a lot of women. So like, what would be and because that woman might not notice any benefits right away as well. So what would you tell them or recommend that they explore in order to like kind of make that mental shift?
Yeah. So a good first step would be follow me on Twitter, right? So just get the education, so dive into, why something like this may be important. Educate yourself on the potential negatives of continuing down the path that you're in now with your footwear situation, or continue down the path of leaving this problem unaddressed. So once again, you can show a real live example with the generations that are a little bit uh, further into wearing conventional footwear. You see these physical changes. You see, and Melker does a great job with Wide about educating on the risk of falls in association with foot health. And that's a big project that I think him and his team are working on with My Foot Function, is this correlation between foot health and falls. So as you age, the decrease of the amount of surface area that you're able to stand on decreases your ability to balance. So if you can separate the toes, if you can get these toes to splay out and spread like they were intended, then over time your balance increases, your proprioception increases, and that a lot of people just need a little bit more of a logical explanation. Like, look, no human was born with shoes on. And that's kind of how God intended, it's exactly how God intended for it to be. And so some people take a little bit more of a logical explanation, and some people need more of like an analytical numbers type of education aspect. So that would be like the statistics of falls in relation to, foot health. And I think that's a key point to, allude to the project that Melker and his team are working on.
That's a great example, and I haven't even thought about that. Even for maybe an older guy as well, that's maybe not concerned with physical health. Like I know that's one of the main injuries and harms uh, of like that what's the word, that plagues like older people in general. So that's actually a
Mm,
great angle, I think, that could really get somebody that's sort of past the point of caring about performance, because falls are serious things. And your point about the service area, that's another great example about like a building. Like a building's foundation is not typically the same width or same area as it is like as it goes up, if that makes sense. It's typically wider, right? Like because
right.
then there's more stability, more function. It's the same with the feet, right? Like that makes so much sense to me, that the wider my toes are, the more proprioception, the more uh, the better I am at being able to control my toes and allowing my nerves to signal to the stabilizer muscles, like, hey, this is how we need to react to this stimulus and so on. That 100% increases balance, which 100% decreases likelihood of falling. So that's a really good angle to take. A question that just came to my mind: what are your thoughts on toe spacers?
Yeah, I utilize toe spacers myself. I send all my clients toe spacers along with a few other tools when I'm working with them one on one. Super advantageous tool to implement into your process. Um, there is a little bit of an acclimation period with those as well, just because you've been in super narrow toe boxes. So going with a little bit more of a progressive approach over time, those can definitely help. I've seen some people have the ability to combine toe spacers with wide toe box shoes. Um, I'm kind of in a process of analyzing some data personally on this, because when you add a physical obstruction to the mechanics of the toes during walking or running, This can be in the form of a narrow toe box, or it can be in the form of wedging the spacers in between the toes. So if you were to wedge the spacers in between the toes, this would limit the adduction or the coming together of the toes that is necessary to an extent during the gait phase or running phase. So I'm personally kind of seeing the results of this. I'm doing it just to see the effects. I have run into a client that I didn't actually prompt them to do this, but she wanted to try, and she had a negative outcome with running with the toe spacers in. And I think it came from the mechanical limitations of adduction from the toes. All this being said, I think spacers are extremely beneficial for, you can slap them on while you're just around home, especially if you're kicked back on the computer, watching Netflix. I've seen a ton of benefits wearing them for about a half hour to an hour before a workout, or even before going running, because it kind of sends a signal to the body that, you're allowed to splay the toes in a more natural fashion to go into what activities are next. So the body kind of remembers that space that's created in the time before.
Well, first off, I'm one to, on occasion, probably a few times a week, I'll walk or run with toe spacers in with my wide toe box shoes.
What's been your
but
feedback?
I think I might be. I mean, I've been wearing toe spacers since I think I was a freshman in college. Like I was getting shit from so many guys, like, what's
Really?
on your toes and stuff like that. But oh yeah, 100%. So I've been wearing them for probably 6 years, on and off, but relatively regularly. And I'll tell you this much: I remember one practice specifically, and it's so funny. This is why I think it's actually important, because how many practices I went to, I have no clue. Every single time I went to practice, I put on shoes and I don't remember it. But one particular day, I was like, you know what? I'm going to put my toe spacers on with my regular cleats, with the narrow toe box and like all the regular mechanics of regular shoes. And my feet have never hurt so bad, because it was like I was like pushing my toes into the extremely repressive nature of the regular shoe. And I vividly remember being like, I had to like step out of practice real quick and like take them off and then put my cleats back on. So that was definitely not a good idea. But like for ultras, you mentioned ultra shoes, for example. I run right now in ultras, and those are very wide toe box. And I think my feet are already pretty wide. I mean, like I can splay my feet relatively wide. So I haven't noticed any negatives, but I do understand what you're saying as far as it relates to any physical like alteration while you're running. So yeah, I haven't noticed any negatives per se, but
and it's situational dependent for sure.
Yeah, that's I mean, just like you mentioned, every body is different. So
exactly.
The idea that I just kind of thought about as well in terms of like conceptualizing how this works. So you think about like what like when you break a bone, you put a cast on so that it's an external force that forces your bone specifically to adapt and corrects itself. In a way, like modern shoes are a cast that have negatively forced our feet into a specific shape, I guess, or form.
Right.
What I think toe spacers are kind of like the inverse of that. They're like an external force that kind of acclimate our feet, or kind of like reform our feet. So does that make sense? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and a comparison analogy you could use is like braces for your teeth. So people that have a negative palate that limits their ability to eat or speak correctly, then more than likely they would need braces or some sort of like a internal device to spread their palate or correct their teeth. And this would be an example that kind of parallels to the toe spacers. You're utilizing a tool in order to return to a correct position or mechanics. Yeah, definitely.
The braces is a great analogy. I think that that hits home for me. It makes a lot of sense intuitively. One question, one point of conversation I had with Melker that kind of threw me for a loop was flip flops.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on flip flops? Traditional flip flops?
Yeah, so they simply just alter your gait mechanics. I'm not sure what Milker's opinion was, but you kind of have to use the toes in a certain way to grip the shoe itself in order to kind of keep the shoe on during gait or during walking. Now, when you add a strap around the heel that keeps the shoe on to the foot, then most flip flops would actually be, pretty good in that situation, simply for the fact that the toes have a ton of freedom. Um, most flip flops are zero drop and pretty low supportive. But yeah, flip flops are not the greatest. But if you were to choose flip flops over, let's just say, super narrow Nikes, then I would probably be more inclined to say, yeah, cycle your flip flops in a little bit more often with the Nikes.
Yeah,
What was his
that's the
opinion on
same.
it? I'm curious.
He relayed a similar take on it. He basically said that you think, like, intuitively you're like, okay, flip flops good, open space, my feet can spread, uh, usually zero drop and things like that. He mentioned the exact same thing. You kind of have to like uh, pull the shoe, like keep the shoe pulled on with your toes as you're walking, which is not a natural gait. So
Yeah.
as a result of that, I threw mine away. So thanks, Melker. I appreciate it. I appreciate that. But no, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's a common, not misconception, but like people wear flip flops all the time, and it's kind of one of those things. I'm like, dang, I do like wearing flip flops, but to me, it just, it's not like I care enough about wearing flip flops that I want to, like, over the long term affect my gait, because as you mentioned, what's the number one way that we get around life? It's walking. So I want to
Yeah.
optimize my walk as much as I can. Um,
Yeah.
the
I want to bring up a point real quick with where we're at. I think this would be a good thing to bring up is something like the 80-20 rule. So, like an example would be Rob, the grounded athlete.
Sure.
I love watching his content. I actually haven't talked to him personally yet, but I love what he's doing. And he owns and makes barefoot style or minimalist style sandals, right? But you see in his content that he's wearing Nike running shoes when he's at the track, or he's wearing like some no bulls at the gym or something like that. Then I guarantee you Rob is kind of using some sort of a similar rule to the 80-20 rule, which means 80% of your time, if your feet are in an environment that are anatomically natural, which is like in a barefoot shoe or completely barefoot, something with a wide toe box, zero drop. And then the 20% of the time where you're in an athletic environment to where these are unnatural type of requirements that we're placing our body through. So an example would be playing baseball in spike cleats, wearing spike shoes at the track, wearing soccer cleats. That can be your 20%. As long as you're diligent with your 80%, then that small percentage, that the 20 to 15%, won't really force a whole lot of negative adaptation out of the body. And like I said, these are just unnatural things that we're requiring out of our human body. So sometimes we have to use unnatural tools in order to create leverage in those type of environments or situations.
Very well said. I think that's a really important point. And that kind of brings back the pragmatic view,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it doesn't have to be 100 or zero. The 80-20 is um, definitely applicable. And this kind of brings up a point. You do shoe reviews, right? You've probably tested, how many shoes do you think you've tested out?
Oh man. Personally, away from Twitter, I've probably tested a couple of dozen, maybe even more than that. Since I started the shoe reviews on Twitter, been blessed that some shoe companies reach out to me and send me some pairs to review. I think I'm nearing close to like 10 or 12 that are either been posted or I have in the drafts. So that's pretty exciting. And yeah, there's a ton of different brands of minimalist style footwear out there, and people, they just love shoes. Like, we're in a shoe consumer society, so everybody's looking for, okay, then just tell me what the best shoe for my situation or this application is, and that's the reason behind the reviews. But yeah, man, I've I've tested and gone through and reviewed quite a few for sure. which is fun. I love
I don't
doing
want.
that for companies.
Oh yeah, that's got to be because it's also, it just like taps you into a little bit more awareness. Like as you're wearing the shoe or doing things, you're kind of taking note of certain things and
Mhm.
certain commonalities that are good, maybe bad. I'm curious. In no way, shape, or form do I want you to throw any under the bus. So I'll ask like the inverse of that question. Are there any shoes that you that you've reviewed and been like, oh wow, I really really like these. I like what these guys are doing.
Yeah, there's a few that come to mind. Wide would be one of them. This is one of the most recent companies that sent a shoe. They actually sent me and my wife Aubrey a pair, and she loves them. She's been in Vivos primarily through her barefoot shoe journey, and she's just like, man, like my feet since wearing these have become even more sore, just because of the physical limitations of Vivo's toe box is a little bit more narrow than the wides, and she absolutely loves the wides. I am perfectly in tune with that too. The wides have been a pretty significant eye opener to me as far as, yeah, barefoot shoes typically will have a wide toe box, but the wides really do have a massive amount of room in the toe box, and I have a massive amount of toe splay. So those shoes accept that, and that 13 millimeter sole versus, like you said, the 3, 4, 5 millimeter sole is, I think, something that's very unique to wide that they're doing well for the exact reasons that you mentioned previously. Also, another company is Tolos. Evan Ritt is the guy behind that. He's out of Colorado. Absolutely incredible guy. Love working with him. He is he's really got an insanely cool story. I actually had him on a Twitter Spaces, and he kind of told his story there. And Tolos to me are one of the most, or if not the most, aesthetically pleasing barefoot shoes on the market. Typically, barefoot shoes just don't have the aesthetic appeal of conventional footwear. But Tolos and Evan, they really nailed it. And then another company that I'm not actually an affiliate for, but is very notable, is Avancus. Um, I've actually talked to the owner uh, during the development and process, and then kind of after as well. They designed the shoe as more of a powerlifting type shoe. So it has a lot more of like the lateral stability, which means that the sole's a little bit wider, and it kind of it eliminates the spillover that you get from some super minimalist barefoot shoes. So in the gym, especially, the Avancus are top notch.
That's awesome. That's good to hear from Melker because I think he's such a good dude as well. And
Yeah.
obviously I think are they shipping to the U.S. yet?
Yep.
I don't even know.
Yep.
See, I don't know if they have my size, but I think the aesthetic of those shoes are cool as well. And I think you're exactly right. A lot of the reluctance for a lot of people is the aesthetic of a lot of barefoot shoes, which is totally fine. Like I understand that.
Yeah.
It's you don't want to like have like the weird looking shoes. So it is kind of that the journey for barefoot shoes, I think, is like the marketability of the look that will allow them to become more mainstream and allow people to kind of start their journey. One of the
Yeah.
ugliest shoes I think that people can wear, but for the folks that like myself who don't really care, the have you ever tried any of the shoes that have like the actual individual toe spaces, like the five
Oh
finger
yeah.
shoes?
Yeah. Those are the
What are your thoughts on
OG
those?
barefoot shoes. I actually, of course, love them, and I've had a tweet that did pretty well one time, and it parallels to my thoughts behind it. It's like you think you can hurt my feelings? Like I chose to wear these shoes out in public. I just don't care because these shoes, like, they're literally just a cover for protection of the sole of your foot and nothing else. So they protect your foot from hot, sharp, or cold, and then nothing else beyond that. There's zero restriction. I think I think they're great, but they're super on the realm of barefoot shoes. They are the absolute most minimal. So when there was those shoes first came out, a lot of people went straight into them. They started running marathons in them, and they had a lot of negative initial effects that came from wearing those shoes, but they just didn't transition, and they didn't have enough baseline strength and mobility within their feet to accept being able to do that. There is a brand, I think it's Mark Sisson, the CEO or the founder of Primal Kitchen.
Yeah.
He created a brand called Paluva, um, and I think up until like the most recent year, like maybe 21 or 22, that Vibram had that patent on the split toes, and now Paluva has actually created a shoe to where it has a little bit more of like a padded sole to it. I'm not sure on the actual dimensions of the thickness of the sole, but it's enough there to provide a little bit of a give when you're running on asphalt or concrete. And that is actually my preferred running shoe as of right now. And they're the split toes. They're aesthetically not the greatest. They kind of look like a grandpa shoe. In my opinion, they're like the New Balance of the barefoot shoe world. So, take what you will with that. But in my opinion, they've been a great addition to my running game.
Yeah, I'm gonna check those out because I actually bought a pair of Vibrams back in the day, my sophomore year of college, and I tried them on, and I literally sent them back. I was like, I'm just not gonna wear these in public. Which is funny. I mean, I've definitely progressed. Like, I don't care now, but it was funny. I'm like, yeah, there's a 0% chance I wear these, so send them right back. What's your who said this? I can't remember who said it on Twitter, but somebody was basically saying if you wear shoes all day, which most people do, a great place to start is just not wearing shoes when you're at your house. Because some people literally just walk around the house, flip flops, shoes on still. Like just when you walk in the door, just take them off. Do you think that's a good practice?
I think that's a great practice. Yeah, because you're in a controlled environment at that point. You don't have to worry about the hot, sharp, or cold elements typically when you're in your house. So yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And when you're walking around in your house, typically it's pretty short distances. You might get maybe maximum 2 to 3K steps a day while you're in your house. So I think that's a great starting point.
Yeah, and it keeps your house cleaner, so. But
Definitely.
One thing I saw you post about this at some point, maybe it was on Instagram, but just like the actual gait, like the mechanics of walking and like the heel strike as it relates to how it disperses the energy up the chain. Can you talk about that a little bit and how are we supposed to heel strike, or is it supposed to be like toes first? How does a natural gait occur?
Yeah, so walking is going to be different than running. Let's go over walking first. So a normal, what you would want to see out of a person's gait pattern would be a heel strike. If you look at the anatomy of the heel bone, the calcaneus, it's kind of in this ball shape. So it's got a rocker to it, and it's very thick, and it's meant to be able to handle a normal walking strike. And then so let's just go over the gait cycle. So you strike on your heel, and then as your body comes over the top of the foot, then you typically have a flattening of the foot so that the weight is dispersed up through the kind of the arch of the foot, or mainly the outside aspect of the foot, so behind your pinky toe. And then as your weight translates over the top of the foot, then you kind of have a rolling inward motion that the weight translates from the outer aspect of the foot towards the big toe. And then you have toe off, which your big toe helps to push and create the next step. Now, during gait, when you strike on the heel and then the weight comes over the top of the foot will pronate. Pronation is actually something that's good if you don't have overpronation. And that just means that your arch absorbs the shock of the step, flattens out, and then as your weight comes over the toes or off the toes, then the arch actually reshapens into its arch form, and it kind of creates a little bit of propulsion mechanism. So that's going to be.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just so you go, a gait would be supination first, and then pronation, generally, or like about.
Yeah. So most people will strike on the outer half or outer third of their heel. And then so automatically that kind of pushes more weight to the outside or pinky side of your foot. And then as your weight goes over the top of the foot, then you pronate from there. So technically, yes, you would have a little bit more supination at heel strike. And then as the weight comes over the top of the body, you have more pronation.
And then
Great.
what about the running gait? Or I guess I don't know if that would be the gait, but what about running? How does that differ?
Yeah, so running mechanics are definitely different. This is where we will get into the difference between running as we know it for distance and marathons and Ironmans versus like a primal running pattern. So, and I've been trying to write a thread that is able to cover this concept, and to condense this down is really tough. So let's go over the primal running mechanics and how they're supposed to happen first. So humans mechanically are born to run either with a mid to forefoot strike. And there's a lot of anatomical reason behind that. First one being the arch of the foot. So the arch of the foot behaves much like a leaf spring on like a trailer or a truck on the rear axle. So a leaf spring looks like an upside down U, and it kind of has this half moon shape. Now, when pressure is put into the bed of the truck or on top of the trailer, then the spring expands and the two distal points go further away from one another, which is very similar to the mechanics of the arch of your foot, if not almost exactly parallel. So as you strike when you're running, then the arch of your foot expands or pronates to absorb the shock. It's almost like a spring. Then you have the Achilles tendon, the strongest tendon in the entire body. It behaves somewhat similar to a rubber band. So if you were to strike on your forefoot, then the calf and the Achilles tendon also has to absorb the shock of the impact. So what happens is the Achilles tendon and the calf is kind of placed on a stretch, just like pulling a rubber band apart. And then when you have the release of the stretch, then it's kind of like you let go of one end of the rubber band, and it releases this energy to create propulsion. Now, these shock absorption mechanics are taken away or not utilized when you have a heel strike run pattern. If you were to look at a video parallel or side by side, like you and I are on the screen here, of someone heel striking while running versus forefoot striking while running, you'll notice that the forefoot or midfoot striker, their head is more level while they're running, versus a person that heel strikes, there's a lot more up and down motion. And that's where you have a discrepancy in the energy consumption of the body while it's running. So let's go over the mechanics of heel striking. So initially, when you heel strike while you're running, then the only shock absorption that you have is taken away. And the body is going to absorb the shock no matter what, because you're basically stomping the ground. This force is not taken away by the cushion of the pad of the heel of the shoe. It's just translated up the kinetic chain through the ankle, the knee, the hip, and into the low back. And it has to go somewhere within, and it's distributed through those points of the body. Now, you will also notice that when somebody is heel strike running versus forefoot strike, that a heel strike typically will occur out in front of the body, out in front of the center of mass of the body. So if I were to draw a line through my head down to my ankles, then the heel strike would happen in front of the body. Now, when you get somebody barefoot or in minimalist shoes that they're striking forefoot or midfoot strike, that strike happens almost directly underneath the body. So there's a few things that happen differently, one versus the other. Now, I want to go back to what I alluded to in the beginning of this subject here, is the difference between primal running and long distance running. And that comes back to the discrepancy that I've kind of wanted to hit on throughout the podcast, is that's just not a natural movement for people to run, 26 miles in a marathon on asphalt continuously. So you might have to utilize tools in order to create, a happy medium there. So more than likely, more people are going to tend to heel strike during a long distance run like that, which is not preferred, but it kind of is what it is. So coaching can help with changing the mechanics. Obviously, getting into something like an ultra that is zero drop wide toe box will kind of bring the foot a little bit more under the center of center of mass of the body. So there's a little bit of discernment and discrepancy there. I will say that adding a ton of cushion under the foot for long distance running is actually going to be more than likely negative for the body, just because you have so much play within the amount of like how your ankle reacts to the cushioning under the foot. And that translates for variability at the knee and the hip. So there's a lot of energy consumption there, and you get into like impact forces over time. And it's just kind of been proven that heel striking over time can lead to a little bit of like accumulation of impact forces, which leads to a little bit more of like a degeneration of joints and so on.
Yeah,
that was kind of a long stretch.
Always, no, that's, I appreciate you being thorough, because that's important. I think just people, I think people don't even really think about it, and also just the difference between primal running and long distance running and all this stuff, I think is important to understand, because we weren't, like you mentioned, it's not like most people were not, even our ancestors were not running 26 miles continuously, right? They were doing sprints, or then walking, then sprints and walking, etc. So I think it's important to make that distinction. There's also, I've seen folks that sort of walk really externally rotated, right? What could be the negative impacts of that, like where your feet are pointing out as you walk?
Yeah, that most of the time is actually a result of something up the kinetic chain, specifically the hips. So people just have a little bit more of external rotation at the hips, but they don't have a sufficient amount of internal rotation. And progressively, if you have weak feet, if your feet pronate inwards, then this creates an internal rotation of the tibia, which is your shin bone, and in return creates a little bit of an internal rotation at the femur as well, which is your thigh bone. So that pronation with the kind of the toe out pattern is very typical with people that have weak feet and very weak musculature surrounding the hips and lack of mobility at the hips as well. And I have to correct that with a lot of my clients.
Yeah, because so with pitching, I was a pitcher in baseball. Pitching is, the hips are extremely important, and one of the main metrics or heuristics or things that you focus on to try to throw harder is hip internal rotation, because then it allows you to like stay in your legs longer down the slope. So I was always like trying to maximize my hip internal rotation and learning about external versus internal. And as far as I understand it, we have a strong propensity as a human population nowadays to have externally favored hips, because we're just so weak in our hips, like you mentioned, like we don't do things to strengthen them. And I think even, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have a significant amount, a significantly larger amount of external rotating muscles than internally rotating muscles, which sounds to me like it's probably a cause for that. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I do see that quite commonly. A lot of it has to do with the glutes, actually. So most people are going to be kind of quad dominant, and the glutes are supposed to be the most powerful muscles in the body. But a lot of people just have that syndrome, that no ass at all syndrome. They just don't use their glutes near enough. So yeah, some people, they just will have an abundance of weakness within their external rotators, which is typically accompanied by some glute weakness. Some people will have weakness of their internal rotators, and that typically is accompanied by glute weakness as well. So it would take a little bit of like a inaction assessment to determine like if somebody is quad dominant, if they're internally rotating because of what's happening at their foundation, or if it's a combination of at their hips and the foundation. So that's when it gets into a little bit more of like the necessity for actually an assessment to happen,
Yeah, gotcha. I think we've covered a lot on the shoes and feet um, realm, but there's a couple of things about you and especially on social media and stuff that I want to dive into. Live slow. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah, man. It's kind of the mantra surrounding myself and the way that I like to live my life, I guess. And it just to encompass it really means to just live way more in the moment, to recognize the abundance within the simplicities that are around you at any given point, to kind of be able to sit still and be able to actually hear God guide your thoughts, and eliminating the external stimulus that usually clogs your ability to hear from God in such a manner. So, stimulus is going to come from social media, work stress, relationship stress, and then when you eliminate all of that stimulus, and then you can also eliminate anticipation for what's next on my calendar, what am I going to have to deal with tomorrow, what's upcoming that's going to provide a lot of stress for me. When you live slow and you really embody this lingo, if you will, then it really kind of sinks you into the present moment. You can kind of simplify everything, and you just enjoy the present. And the only time technically in existence that you can control is right now. And if you're always living at the speed of chaos, then you'll never actually gain that control. So it's kind of a dive into living slow.
I like it, man. I think it's counterintuitive in many ways, at least to the mainstream narrative now, where it's like bam, bam, bam. You got to optimize. You got to do this. You got to do that. Sometimes that's literally like all you need is, like you said, just to live slower, like live more presently, do less, but do less better, have less things, but have higher quality things.
Mm.
It's a paradigm that I've really tried to adopt recently is the whole idea of less. Like on my journal that I'm literally taking notes on right now, the only thing written on the cover is less. Just because I have a
Mm.
tendency to go in so many directions and try to do so many things. And in reality, that's you can do everything, you can do anything, but you can't do everything, right? So you got to be
Yeah.
selective with what you do. And you're also a pretty big outdoorsman, as we've mentioned. But as far as I understand, you recently had a child. Is that correct?
Yeah. She's almost 3 months old.
How has fatherhood changed you?
It is the most hard to grasp experience. It's hard to conceptualize, but it's the most absolutely rewarding experience as well. I've never experienced the amount of love that God's kind of instilled in the ability for me to just like look down at my daughter, and simultaneously, while I'm just so in love with her, my heart breaks because of how much I love her. And it seems like God just kind of implements the concept of eternal love and unconditional love into a birth of a child that is yours. My priorities have completely changed. Like nothing else in the world comes before that baby girl and my wife. The love for my wife has just gone through the roof, and I didn't know that could even happen. Uh, we have such a strong relationship, and then to share the bond of a child is unlike anything I've ever experienced. It's also super super scary, especially within the first month or so. Like I couldn't help myself but just constantly go over there and like check if she's breathing, or
Yeah.
she gets like a little choked up during a feeding, and you're like, oh my gosh, like we got to save her immediately. It's super scary. Also, it forces you to be a little bit slower as well. It forces you to be present. And I'm very thankful for the fact that, I own my own business now. I can work from home. So I'm able to help my wife and just be here for a lot more of those little moments that I might not be able to be experiencing if I was still, working in a clinic somewhere and having to go somewhere Monday through Friday.
That's so cool to hear. The part that you just mentioned, you love her so much that your heart breaks. That's
Yeah,
Man, that's powerful stuff, man. And I just always love talking to especially new fathers, young fathers. I've had a couple on the pod, and just it's unanimous, the men that I've talked to, how it's changed them, how it's altered their personality, and as you mentioned, to a T, it's in it opens some door for love that, like, people don't understand. I remember my dad always telling me, he's like, you're never gonna understand until you have your own, and that
yeah,
seems to be the commonality.
yeah. And I brushed that off. The exact comment, like you just don't know until you have your own. I brushed that off, like, yeah, I think I've loved people before as much as I can, but man, it really does open a whole new door, and it's very hard to, like I said, to kind of depict unless you have a child. But I'm also thankful that my wife and I are in a position to where we are allowed to kind of experience this love without a whole lot of external stress about finances, which I'm still a young entrepreneur within my journey. So but luckily I'm about a year and a half in now, so where my feet are a little bit more solid on the ground. And we've been married for a few years and our relationship is super strong. So I'm just thankful that a lot of the stars aligned for us to have a kid at this point in our lives. To because life can take away from an experience if you're not exactly in a position.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also this idea that in many things in life we wait for the perfect time, and I've spoken about this before. I don't have a kid, but the same can be said for business, or quitting that job, or starting that hobby, or even like asking that girl out, or having a kid. There's never a perfect time. It's kind of like
No,
the perfect time is the time that never happens. So it's like you keep pushing it back. So I think it's because I've spoken to several fathers that kind of just uh, more or less not happened upon it, but like just said, you know what, like this is it. Kind of just like got thrown in the face, like, okay, this is the time right now. It's not a perfect time, but we're going to make the best of it.
yeah, yeah, and that was pretty similar to like my wife and I's decision. Back in, so we found out we were pregnant, I think last November, I believe, and then February through like April of this year was like a pretty tough point for me business wise. It was just a low valley, and I started to second guess like if this was sustainable, if I could do this, if I was able to provide with my family, and then just really spent a lot of time in prayer and time with God. And, I just told him, like, I'm going to trust you during this, and I'm going to put in the work that I think is going to be required in order for us to be able to sustain just off of the business. And that way my wife can stay home with the newborn, and, there's a roof over our heads and food in our bellies. And God has blessed me with an abundance just since that amount of time. And I'm super thankful for that. So back then it's like, yeah, the time wasn't right for a few reasons, but it really was. Like, I just had to bring myself to trust that, like, this is not your timing. It's God's timing. And so you gotta lean into that.
You've mentioned God and prayer several times. What does your faith mean to you?
Man, it's everything to me. It really is something that is I think the human experience is what was intended in God's eyes. To me, God took on human form as as Jesus to walk the earth, to be able to give a kind of a relation to the human experience. Like, he experienced what it meant to walk on earth as you and I did, and to be able to relate to a higher being. uh, it's kind of hard to depict the importance. something that I try to stay as diligent as possible with. And then when there are times that I don't stay in the word or stay in prayer, I can really notice a lack of God in my life. And it hits me hard. So, and I'm thankful for that because, without it's just how I approach life. And so the way that I approach life is there's a lot of characteristics that Jesus obtained or possessed. And this would be things like generous, kind, unconditional type of love. He would sit at the table with people from all types of dynamics and have no judgment and be able to, just love and care for people no matter what their circumstances are. And that's just the what I try to possess as well, those characteristics throughout my day. Do I fail? 100%, almost on daily. But if I can keep that and just kind of stay in that walk with him, I've just noticed that it's an absolute necessity. And it's to say it changed my life would be an understatement, but it really is the basis that I live my life on. And I will admit, like we're humans, and the forgiveness that comes along with that, and the grace, that unconditional grace is, I'm so thankful for it, because we just make mistakes, man. It's just part of it.
Yeah, we sure do. That's really cool to hear, man. I think that there's a certain level of chaos that we exist in now. I think like our world is heavily skewed towards chaos now. There's a famous quote by Nietzsche, the I think he's a German philosopher. Have you heard this quote where he says God is dead?
I don't think I have.
So it's a famous quote, and he says God is dead, and many people interpret that as a like an atheistic perspective, but really he's not saying that God doesn't exist. He's saying that we in the West have or he passed, but like he was saying that we in the West have killed God out of our lives. We've taken him out of our lives. And I think that in many ways is why I think it's accurate, because I think that's why our lives in the world have become so chaotic. And then because we don't have that order of God, that order of the higher power that God provides. So I'm always fascinated by that. And just the idea of prayer and, like you mentioned, living slow allows you to hear, right? Like when you're always running around, head up in just running around, stimuli, overwhelmed, there's too much static. There's too much stimulus that clouds out being able to hear and talk with God and listen to God. So I think that's awesome, man. I really appreciate you sharing that as well. I wasn't planning on going down that route.
Yeah. And a lot of, let's just say, new Christians or non-Christians will hear that statement like you hear from God. And in my personal experience, I've never actually like heard a big booming voice inside my head or anything. It's just the fact that, and this was a big pivot point in my faith, was just maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I moved from Arkansas to Florida for a year. The first few months that we were there, I didn't take a job. I just needed some time off. So every morning I would go out, take my journal, take the Bible, and then I just, for some reason, had the inkling to like stop talking when I was praying and just like see where my mind went. And I just realized that God was guiding my thoughts. And it was because I shut up. And he was actually able to put some thoughts in my head, and then I would almost audibly speak out loud and then just shut up again, and it seemed like he guided my thoughts again. And a journal was a big part of that. And just getting back to like the importance of it in my life, during that 3-month period, I took my journal out with me, and then I just didn't know which direction I wanted to head in life. And so I was like, well, if I don't know which direction to head, maybe I can see where I've been. So I started to write out kind of my story within the last 5 to 10 years. And I had made some really big decisions that I, in the past, thought were super small decisions, but they were these big, like coincidental decisions. And I was like, man, like God really put these certain people, these certain decisions in my life to put me exactly where I'm at today. And it blew me away. I was like 15, 16 pages in, and I just couldn't believe it.
Man, that's cool. The power of journaling is another topic in and of itself, and just once again, we're so overstimulated. We have so many thoughts and so many things going on. It's unless, and they're all like in the ether. Like our thoughts are kind of just out there, but until you like write them down or speak about them, you can't really. There's no way to delineate them. And then how can you have clarity of vision, of purpose, of mission, of meaning without delineating the thoughts? So I think prayer is another way of doing that. Prayer and journal and speaking. That's how we articulate our thoughts, and in the end, that's how we clarify them. So I think that's awesome. Yeah. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up too. I mean, that gets me fired up to go attack the day. Austin, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights. Is there anything else you want to add, and where can people find you?
As far as adding goes, man, I think you did an awesome job on the podcast, and the previous episodes that I've listened to. I think you're doing an awesome job. I don't know how I haven't seen you up until the point that you reached out to me, but I'm very glad that our paths have crossed, and I'm super excited for you specifically to what you're doing and where you're headed. And wish you nothing but success. As far as I go, my goofy self, if you wanted to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, it's both at barefoot_will_, or you can go to my website and check out about that. It's going to be Roave, ROAV, outdoorexp.com. And that's going to be where you kind of see all of the journaling and the retreat side of things. It's kind of my main website. So, yeah.
Very cool. I appreciate you saying that. Firstly, and secondly, I'll have all that linked in the show notes. I'm very, very glad that we crossed paths. Hopefully one of these days I'll be able to make my way to Arkansas, and maybe we can link up in person.
Yeah, man, that'd be dope. Take it to the Ozarks.
Oh gosh, dude, I don't know if I'm ready for that. Right on. And with that, I hope y'all enjoyed the conversation with Austin. Really, really profound insights, in my opinion, on foot health, but also the other things we spoke about in terms of living a slow life, the importance of outdoors, being a father, being a young father, and how that changes a man, the importance of living slow so you can hear God, and not to mention the practical insights that we talked about in terms of foot health and how that can change your physical health for the better. So it was an honor to sit down with him. I hope y'all found some value in this. Until next time, stand firm in the arena.